At my father's black tie birthday gala, my brother slapped me across the face and shouted, "You do not belong here." Everyone stared, like I was nothing. Then the governor stood up, looked around the room, and said, "You people really do not know who she is." Silence swallowed the entire ballroom. My brother went pale when the governor said, "She is the one who holds your entire future in her hands." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member. Exactly 24 hours before that humiliating and explosive moment, I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway of the Caldwell family estate. The house sat in one of the most affluent suburbs of Atlanta, a massive brick mansion with towering white pillars and perfectly manicured lawns. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate symbol of success. Inside it was a fortress of judgment and conditional love. I am Nia Caldwell, 32 years old, and the designated black sheep of a family that valued social status above basic human decency. My father, Richard, a former judge, built his entire identity on demanding respect and absolute obedience. My mother, Vivian, a prominent socialite who treated her elite charity board meetings like military campaigns, cared only about projecting the perfect image of a flawless, wealthy family. They did not invite me to this house to celebrate my father's 65th birthday. They summoned me to work. I walked through the heavy oak double doors, and the familiar scent of expensive floral arrangements and harsh lemon polish hit me immediately. It was the smell of my suffocating childhood. The house was a chaotic hive of activity. Caterers, event planners, and florists rushed past me carrying silver trays and massive crystal centerpieces. I was standing in the foyer taking off my coat when my sister-in-law Chloe descended the grand staircase. Chloe was 33, a petite blonde white woman who had perfected the art of weaponized fragility. She was married to my older brother Marcus, the 35-year-old golden boy real estate developer who could simply do no wrong in my parents' eyes. Chloe marched straight toward me, holding a stark white catering apron in her manicured hands. Without a single word of greeting or basic courtesy, she tossed the apron directly at my chest. I caught it by pure reflex, my fingers gripping the rough cotton fabric. "Good, you are finally here," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and undisguised contempt. "Put that on and go straight to the kitchen. The catering staff needs help polishing the silver for tomorrow night." I looked at the cheap apron in my hands and then looked directly into her pale blue eyes. "I am a guest, Chloe, not the hired help." She let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed against the marble floors. "Oh, Nia, please let us not pretend. Your mother said you needed to make yourself useful if you wanted to attend this gala. Besides, look at how you are wearing your hair." She gestured vaguely toward my natural curls, a style I wore with absolute pride and confidence. "It is a bit unruly for a formal setting, do not you think? Vivian has all her friends coming tomorrow. The entire Jack and Jill society will be here. You will blend in much better in the back with the kitchen staff where nobody has to explain your situation." I tightened my grip on the apron. The sheer audacity of her words was staggering, but completely expected. Chloe had spent the last 5 years using subtle insults to tear me down, always hiding behind a mask of delicate innocence whenever Marcus or my parents were in the room. She loved playing the victim while actively throwing poison darts. "Unruly." I repeated, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "My hair is natural, Chloe. Just because it does not fit your narrow, elitist definition of acceptable does not mean I am going to hide in a kitchen." She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her expensive designer blouse. "Do not pull the race card with me, Nia. I am just being practical about our image. Marcus is closing a massive urban development deal tomorrow night. Governor Sterling is going to be here to celebrate with us. We need everything to be absolutely flawless to secure this state funding. We simply cannot have a college dropout wandering around the main ballroom making important guests uncomfortable with her presence." The word dropout hung in the heavy air between us. It was the weapon this family used against me for a decade. The ultimate label of failure they slapped on my forehead to make themselves feel vastly superior. You love using that word, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to her. You love calling me a dropout. But you never seem to mention why I had to leave school. Chloe waved her hand dismissively. Because you could not handle the pressure. Everyone knows you cracked under the weight of expectations. You are just not built for high-level success like Marcus is. I laughed, and it was a harsh, bitter sound. Not built for success. Is that the fabricated story Marcus tells you to soothe his fragile ego? Let me refresh your memory since you married into this family and conveniently ignore the ugly truth. 10 years ago, I was an honors student. I was on track to graduate at the absolute top of my class. I had my entire future brilliantly mapped out. But then your perfect husband decided he wanted to play the role of a tech entrepreneur. He started a company with a business plan that a child could see was doomed to fail. He needed capital. He needed a lifeline because no legitimate bank in this state would lend him a single dime. I took another step forward, forcing Chloe to step back against the staircase railing. And what did my loving parents do to save their golden boy? They drained my college fund. They emptied every single account they had set up for my education and handed every last cent to Marcus. They wrote him a check for hundreds of thousands of dollars and watched his startup crash and burn exactly 6 months later. They sacrificed my future to fund his absolute delusion. I was forced to leave school because my own parents stole my tuition to cover his massive financial failures. They stole my money, they stole my time, they stole my dignity, and they demanded I stay silent about it to protect his precious reputation. Chloe flushed a dark, angry red. Her carefully constructed polite mask slipping completely to reveal the arrogant woman underneath. That is a lie, she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. Richard and Vivian paid for Marcus because he is the heir to this family legacy. He is a visionary. He builds tangible things. You were just taking useless classes. They made a strategic financial investment in their son. You are just bitter because you are a failure who works some miserable desk job while my husband is building an empire. He is closing a state-funded real estate deal tomorrow that will make us tens of millions of dollars. He is providing for this family while you do nothing but complain. Providing. I asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. Is that what you call it? You really have no idea what is going on behind the scenes, do you, Chloe? You see the fancy leased cars and the country club memberships, and you think your husband is a king. You have no idea that his entire empire is a fragile house of cards built on suffocating debt and desperate lies. You have no idea how close he is to losing everything. She glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. Put the apron on, Nia. Just do what you are told for once in your miserable life and stop trying to ruin our happiness. You are nothing but a jealous dropout who wants to drag us down to your level. I looked at the white apron in my hands. 10 years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family rushed through my mind in a relentless wave. 10 years of bearing the heavy burden of the strong black woman trope, expected to swallow my pain and carry their secrets. 10 years of letting them believe their own lies while I quietly built a massive private equity firm from the ground up in total secrecy. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply dropped the apron onto the pristine marble floor and stepped right on top of it, leaving a dusty footprint on the white fabric. Then I calmly pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my secure corporate messaging app and typed a single direct order to my chief financial officer. Cancel all of Marcus Caldwell's credit lines. Freeze his bridge loans immediately. I hit send and watched the message deliver. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked at Chloe, who was staring at the dirty footprint on the apron in absolute horror. I am not helping with the silverware, Chloe, I said, my voice completely steady and cold. I will be attending the gala tomorrow night as a fully invited guest. I suggest you tell your visionary husband to check his bank accounts right now. He is going to need a lot more than a polished silver spoon to survive tomorrow night. With a calm and quiet smile, I turned my back on her and walked out the front door, leaving her standing completely alone and speechless in the grand foyer. The clock was officially ticking, and the destruction of the Caldwell facade had just begun. The heavy oak doors of the formal dining room swung open beneath my hands. The air inside felt 10 degrees colder, thick with the scent of roasted rosemary chicken and suffocating pretension. I left Chloe standing in the foyer with her ruined apron and her shattered illusions, but the real battlefield was waiting for me right here. My mother Vivian sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, her posture rigid, her pearls gleaming under the crystal chandelier. My father Richard occupied the head of the table, like a presiding judge, a role he had never truly retired from. And sitting to his right, wearing a bespoke suit that I knew for a fact he had purchased on credit, was Marcus. My brother was in the middle of holding court, gesturing grandly with a silver fork. He was bragging loudly and desperately about the state-funded urban renewal project he was supposedly finalizing. He painted a glorious picture of revitalized city blocks, massive community centers, and affordable housing complexes that his firm was going to build. He spoke of millions of dollars in state grants as if the money were already sitting securely in his bank account. My father nodded in deep approval, swirling his scotch. "That is exactly the kind of vision this family is known for," Richard said, his baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "When Governor Sterling arrives at the gala tonight, you make sure he understands that Caldwell Development is not just a contractor. We are a legacy. You are securing the future of this family named Marcus." I pulled out a chair opposite my brother and sat down quietly. The scraping of the wooden chair legs against the floor cut through their self-congratulatory celebration. My mother finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes swept over my tailored emerald silk suit, lingering on the fabric, as if trying to calculate its exact retail value, before her lips thinned into a line of profound disappointment. "It is a shame your sister does not understand the concept of legacy," Vivian said, directing her words to Marcus, but keeping her eyes locked onto me. "I had to endure another excruciating luncheon with the Jack and Jill Society yesterday. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is for me, Nia? Every other mother in that room has daughters who serve on the regional board, daughters who organize the annual charity balls, daughters who are actually visible in the church community. And what do I have to say when they ask about you? I have to tell them you are too busy sitting in some anonymous cubicle to participate in the traditions of your own people." I picked up my water glass, my expression perfectly neutral. "I work, Mother. Someone has to." "Working is one thing," she snapped back, her voice tightening. "Ignoring your social obligations is another. You are a Caldwell. We are supposed to set the standard for Black excellence in Atlanta. Instead, you avoid the church, you avoid our social circles, and you walk around with that chip on your shoulder because you could not handle the pressure of finishing your degree. You make us look fractured. You make me look like a mother who could not teach her daughter proper grace." The audacity of her words was a familiar poison. She sat there draped in expensive jewelry, complaining about social clubs and church gossip, completely ignoring the fact that the only reason I did not have a degree was because she and my father had stolen my tuition money to fund Marcus and his endless string of failures. They had traded my future for his facade, and now she dared to lecture me about Black excellence. "Leave her alone, Vivian," my father interrupted, setting his glass down with a heavy thud. "We did not invite Nia here today to discuss her social shortcomings. We have business to conduct." He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped exactly in front of my empty plate. I looked at the folder, then up at my father. "What is this?" "It is a simple guarantor agreement," Richard said, his tone shifting into the cold, authoritative cadence he used to use in the courtroom. "Marcus has secured the state grant for the urban renewal project. The governor is fully on board. However, the State Oversight Committee requires Caldwell Development to show a specific threshold of liquid capital before they sign the final release of the funds tomorrow morning. It is a standard bureaucratic hurdle." Marcus leaned forward, flashing that perfect empty smile that had fooled so many investors before. "It is just a temporary bridge loan, Nia. Short-term financing to pad the company accounts so the state auditors see exactly what they need to see." The money will just sit there for 48 hours and then I will pay it right back. I opened the folder. The contract inside was from a predatory lending firm, the kind of shadow institution that charged exorbitant interest rates and specialized in burying desperate developers. I scanned the terms quickly, my eyes catching the specific clauses. Marcus was trying to borrow $2 million. The collateral listed on the document was virtually non-existent, which meant the lender was demanding a personal guarantor with an unblemished credit history and verifiable assets. They wanted me to sign it. They wanted me to put my name on a $2 million high-interest loan because Marcus had completely destroyed his own credit score, and my parents had already leveraged everything they owned to keep his sinking ship afloat. "You want me to co-sign this?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously flat. "You are the only one in the family with no outstanding debt," my father stated, completely unapologetic. "You have a steady job. Your credit is immaculate. Your signature satisfies the lender's risk assessment." I dropped the contract back onto the table. "Let me get this straight. You invited me to this house, allowed your wife to insult me, allowed your daughter-in-law to hand me a catering apron, and now you are ordering me to take on $2 million of toxic debt, so Marcus can pretend he is a successful businessman for the governor tonight." "It is a formality," Marcus snapped, his smile vanishing instantly. "Do not make a big deal out of this, Nia. You are not actually paying anything. You are just lending me your name for 2 days." I looked directly at my brother. "You are bankrupt, Marcus. You have been bankrupt for 6 months. You have defaulted on your last 3 commercial leases, your contractors are preparing to file liens against your company, and you think putting my name on a predatory loan is going to magically fix your incompetence." The color drained from Marcus's face. He shot a panicked look at our father, clearly terrified of how much I actually knew. "Watch your mouth." Richard slammed his hand against the table, rattling the fine china. "You do not speak to your brother that way. He is securing a legacy deal that will benefit this entire family. You owe us this signature, Nia. After everything we have provided for you, putting your name on a piece of paper is the absolute least you can do." "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice rising, vibrating with 10 years of suppressed rage. "You want to talk about what you provided? You provided a masterclass in theft. You drained my college accounts to fund his first failed company. You forced me out of school. I spent my 20s eating cheap noodles and working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head while you bought him a new Porsche to maintain his image. I am not signing anything. I am not setting myself on fire to keep your golden boy warm." I pushed the folder back across the table. It slid off the edge and scattered the pages onto the floor. "Find another scapegoat. I am done paying for his mistakes." Marcus bolted up from his chair. The heavy piece of mahogany crashed backward onto the floor. His face was twisted in an ugly, violent sneer. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can just sit there in your cheap suit and judge me?" I did not flinch. I did not move. I just stared at him. Marcus circled the table, stopping right beside my chair. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. "You are going to sign those papers, Nia, because if you do not, I am going to make a phone call." I looked at him unimpressed. "Who are you going to call, Marcus?" "The bank. They already know you are a fraud." "I am going to call the police," he hissed, his eyes wide and manic. "Dad still has plenty of friends in the district attorney's office. He still has judges who owe him favors. It would be very easy for me to file a report claiming you embezzled funds from the family trust. It would be very easy to manufacture a paper trail that points directly to you. We both know how the justice system works in this state. We both know what happens to a Black woman when a respected former judge and a prominent developer accuse her of a felony. They will lock you up, Nia. They will freeze whatever pathetic little savings account you have. They will destroy your reputation, and you will lose that precious little desk job of yours before the sun goes down tomorrow." The room went completely silent. My mother stared at her plate, refusing to intervene, silently complicit in the threat to destroy her own daughter's freedom. My father sat back in his chair, his silence serving as an absolute endorsement of Marcus's blackmail. They were willing to weaponize the very system that targets our community, willing to throw me into a prison cell just to protect their fragile, failing empire. Marcus slammed both his hands down hard on the table right next to my plate, rattling the glasses. "Sign the papers, Nia," he growled, spit flying from his lips. "Sign the papers right now, or I will ruin your miserable life." I stared at the spot where Marcus had slammed his fist. The crystal water glasses were still vibrating. My mother sat frozen, her silence a loud endorsement of my brother threatening to throw me in prison. My father simply leaned back, taking a slow sip of his scotch, waiting for my submission. They expected tears. They expected begging. They expected the scared college dropout they had manufactured. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my emerald silk suit. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that is what it takes to protect this family's legacy, I will sign your papers." Marcus let out a sharp breath, his posture instantly shifting from violent predator back to arrogant golden boy. "I knew you would see reason, Nia. It is just business." I left my reading glasses and my fountain pen in my bag, I said, looking directly at my father. "I placed it in your study when I arrived. I will go get it and sign right here." My father waved his hand dismissively. "Make it quick. We have catering to review." I turned my back on them and walked out of the formal dining room. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. I did not need a pen. I needed proof. My father's study was located at the far end of the West Wing. It was a room designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, dark leather armchairs, and a massive antique desk that dominated the space. It smelled of expensive cigars and unchecked patriarchal authority. For my entire childhood, this room was strictly off-limits to me. It was the inner sanctum where my father and Marcus discussed the future, while I was sent to the kitchen to help my mother. I closed the heavy oak door behind me and locked it. I had exactly 3 minutes before their impatience turned into suspicion. I did not go to my handbag. I went straight to my father's desk. Richard Caldwell was a man of predictable habits. He operated on the arrogant assumption that no one in his house would ever dare question him, let alone investigate him. He kept a digital safe hidden behind a framed portrait of himself receiving a judicial award, but I knew that safe only held decoy documents and old tax returns. The real secrets, the ugly truths he frantically tried to manage, were always kept in the bottom right drawer of his desk. The drawer with the broken biometric lock he never bothered to fix because he believed his authority was an invisible force field. I pulled the drawer open. It was crammed with thick manila folders, each labeled with Marcus's various shell companies. I grabbed the most recent stack, the ones dated within the last 30 days, and spread them across the polished mahogany surface. The first document was a bank statement for my parents' joint retirement account. I ran my finger down the column of withdrawals. $500,000 transferred out in January, another $300,000 in March. The current balance was less than $4,000. Marcus had not just asked them for help, he had bled them entirely dry. They were penniless. The grand Caldwell estate, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, it was all a hollow facade propped up by maxed-out credit lines. But the retirement account was only the beginning. I opened the second folder. It contained ledgers from the Grace Fellowship Church, the massive congregation where my mother served as the head of the charity committee. She controlled the Community Outreach Fund, a fund built on the donations of working-class families hoping to build a new community center. I stared at the highlighted transfer logs. Marcus had systematically siphoned $2 million from the church's charity fund over the past 8 months. He disguised the transfers as payments to construction vendors for the urban renewal project vendors that did not actually exist. My perfect visionary brother was embezzling money from widows and grandmothers. My mother, the pillar of the Jack and Jill Society, the woman who had just lectured me about moral grace and social obligations, was actively helping him cover up a massive federal crime. They were not just broke, they were criminals. My hands shook, but not from fear. It was the physical manifestation of absolute clarity. They had demanded I sign a predatory loan today because the church board was demanding a financial audit next week. Marcus needed my clean credit to secure a desperate cash injection to replace the stolen church funds before the auditors arrived. If I had signed that paper, I would have become legally tethered to his embezzlement. I would have been the perfect scapegoat. When the scheme collapsed, they would have handed me to the authorities without a second thought. They would have watched me go to prison just to keep Marcus's name clean. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. They loved him enough to destroy their own lives, and they hated me enough to let me take the fall. I reached for the third folder, a thin red file tucked beneath the ledgers. I opened it, and the blood ran cold in my veins. This was not a bank statement. This was a collection of threatening letters and aggressive correspondence from a private equity group known as Obsidian Capital. But Obsidian was not a legitimate bank. In the financial sector, everyone knew Obsidian was a front for private, dangerous money. They were loan sharks in custom-tailored suits. Marcus owed them $5 million, and the principal was compounding weekly. The letters were explicitly clear. If Marcus did not produce a minimum payment of $2 million by the end of the week, Obsidian Capital would seize all physical assets associated with Caldwell Development and begin liquidating personal properties. They were threatening to take the very house we were standing in. I took out my phone and quickly began snapping high-resolution photos of every single document. The retirement statements, the church ledgers, the threatening letters from the shadow lenders. I captured every account number, every forged signature, every damning piece of evidence. This was the ammunition I needed. This was the absolute proof of their rotting foundation. I was so focused on capturing the final page of the Obsidian threat that I did not hear the lock on the study door click open. My father had never fixed the broken biometric lock on his desk, but he clearly had given out master keys to the house. Well, well, well. A sharp, melodic voice sliced through the heavy silence of the room. I froze my phone, hovering over the documents. I turned around slowly. Chloe stood inside the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. The catering apron was gone, replaced by a fresh, perfectly pressed blazer. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, framing a face that was twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive triumph. She looked at the documents spread across the mahogany desk, then looked at my phone and finally locked her pale blue eyes onto mine. She did not look surprised. She looked like a spider who had just watched a fly step directly into the center of her web. "I knew it," Chloe said, stepping further into the room. "I told Marcus you were up to something. I told him you did not just yield that easily. You always have to be the smart one, do you not, Nia? You always have to go digging where you do not belong." I swiftly gathered the folders, tapping the edges against the desk to align them. I belong exactly where I choose to be, Chloe. And right now I am looking at evidence that your husband is going to federal prison. He stole from the church. He bankrupted my parents. And he is in bed with lenders who are going to rip this family apart piece by piece. Chloe let out a soft, mocking laugh. She reached behind her back and pushed the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot in the quiet study. "You really do not get it, do you?" she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "You think you found some big secret. You think you are going to march out of here and play the hero, but all you have done is trap yourself. Open the door, Chloe." I slipped my phone into my blazer pocket, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me sweat, or what she challenged, taking a slow step toward the desk. "You will scream for your daddy. He is the one who helped Marcus forge the church ledgers, Nia. Vivian is the one who authorized the transfers. They all know. I know. We are all in this together to protect the Caldwell name. You are the only outsider here." She stopped a few feet away from me, a wicked, venomous smile spreading across her face. "And now you are locked in a room with classified financial documents you had no permission to access. If I start screaming right now, if I tell Richard and Marcus that I caught you trying to steal proprietary corporate data to sell to a competitor, who do you think they are going to believe?" Chloe reached up and deliberately gripped the collar of her own expensive silk blouse. With one violent, sudden motion, she ripped the fabric straight down the middle, popping the buttons off. They scattered across the hardwood floor like tiny hailstones. She then raised her hand and dragged her own fingernails hard across her cheek, leaving 3 bright red, angry scratch marks. "You are crazy," I stated, watching her perform this calculated self-mutilation with absolute detachment. "I am a terrified white woman who just caught an angry, unstable family outcast trying to commit corporate espionage." Chloe corrected her breathing deliberately, turning shallow and erratic, preparing for her performance. "You attacked me when I tried to stop you, Nia. You got violent. You always were so aggressive." She stepped back toward the locked door, her hand hovering over the handle, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, but her smile remained wickedly intact. "Let us see how independent you are," Chloe whispered when the police arrived to drag you out of your father's house in handcuffs. She opened her mouth and a blood-curdling, desperate scream ripped from her throat, shattering the quiet elegance of the estate. "Help somebody! Help me, Marcus, Richard! Help!" The trap had snapped shut. The footsteps were already thundering down the hallway. "Nia, open this door immediately." The muffled, furious voice of my father vibrated through the heavy mahogany wood. The brass doorknob rattled violently as someone on the other side threw their entire body weight against the thick oak paneling. The walls of the study seemed to shake, but the reinforced door held firm. Chloe stood with her back pressed against the wood, her hand resting casually over the deadbolt. The terrified damsel in distress expression she had worn just seconds ago vanished from her face with the speed of a closing shutter. It was replaced by a chilling, predatory calmness that transformed her completely. She did not look like a panicked woman seeking help. She looked like a seasoned hunter examining trapped prey. She maintained unblinking eye contact with me as she reached her right hand over to her left shoulder. She gripped the collar of her pristine, custom-tailored silk blouse. With a sudden, violent downward yank, she ripped the fabric straight down the center. The expensive pearl buttons popped off, scattering across the polished hardwood floor like a handful of dropped marbles. The silk tore with a loud, abrasive sound, leaving her shoulder completely exposed. She did not stop there. She raised her manicured hands, displaying sharp acrylic nails, and pressed them hard into the tender skin of her own forearms. She dragged her nails downward in a brutal, deliberate motion. 4 angry, jagged red lines welled up immediately, beads of crimson blood rising to the surface and dripping down her pale skin. She did not wince. She did not gasp. Her breathing remained perfectly steady, her eyes locked on mine with a sociopathic intensity. $2 million, Chloe whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the relentless thumping against the door, yet it carried a sharp metallic edge that cut through the noise. "That is the exact amount of liquid capital Marcus needs transferred into the Caldwell Development holding accounts by tomorrow morning. He needs it to satisfy the state auditors, and more importantly, he needs it to keep Obsidian Capital from seizing this estate, our cars, and my entire lifestyle. I know you have it, Nia. You have always been a compulsive little saver, hoarding your miserable paycheck from whatever desk job you work. You are going to open your banking application on your phone right now. You are going to wire every single liquid asset you possess into Marcus's account, and then you are going to digitally co-sign that bridge loan document sitting on the dining room table." Chloe tilted her head, a venomous smile playing on her lips. "If you do exactly as I say, I will unlock this door. I will fall sobbing into my husband's arms and tell them I simply saw a mouse and had a severe panic attack. I will tell them I scratched my own arms backing into the bookshelf in my blind terror. We will all go back to the dining room, finish your mother's dry roast chicken, and pretend this little corporate espionage attempt never happened. You get to walk out the front door and go back to your pathetic, invisible life." She dragged her nails down her other arm, creating a matching set of bleeding lacerations. "But if you refuse," she continued, taking a slow, measured step toward me, "I will unlock that door and collapse onto the hallway floor in a heap of torn silk and blood. I will tell Richard that you cornered me in his study. I will tell him I caught you trying to steal his private financial documents, and when I tried to intervene, you flew into an uncontrollable, violent rage. I will say you tackled me, ripped my clothes, clawed my arms, and threatened to kill me. I looked at the scratches bleeding on her arms, the torn silk hanging off her shoulder. It was a terrifyingly brilliant, deeply sinister performance. It was the ultimate weaponization of her identity. Chloe saw the cold calculation in my eyes, and her smile widened into a shark-like grin. Do not bother trying to formulate a defense, Nia. You are highly intelligent, but you are not smart enough to beat this kind of societal math. Think about exactly how this plays out in the real world. Think about the optics. Think about who I am, and think about who you are. I am the delicate, blonde, white daughter-in-law who was brutally assaulted while bravely trying to protect the family business. You are the estranged, resentful, aggressive black daughter who dropped out of college, carries a massive chip on her shoulder, and actively hates her own brother. When the police arrive, who do you honestly think they are going to look at first? When heavily armed officers walk into this grand estate and see me crying, trembling, bleeding on the marble floor and pointing a shaking finger directly at you, they are not going to ask for your side of the story. They are not going to sit down and calmly review whatever financial documents you think you found. They are going to draw their weapons, throw you against the wall, and put you in handcuffs. That is how this country works. It is a script that has been written, rehearsed, and perfected long before either of us was born, and I know exactly how to play the lead role flawlessly. My tears are a currency you simply cannot match. And it will not just be the police, Chloe whispered, her voice dripping with profound satisfaction. Your own father is banging on that door right now, demanding your submission. Richard Caldwell will not hesitate to throw you to the wolves. He needs Marcus to succeed so his own fragile legacy survives. If putting you in a jail cell for aggravated assault and corporate espionage keeps the spotlight off Marcus's financial crimes, your father will happily lock the cell door himself and throw away the key. Your mother will stand right beside him, dabbing her dry eyes for the local news cameras, talking about how she tried to save her troubled, violent daughter, but tragically failed. They will sacrifice you without a single second thought to protect their golden boy and his fragile, victimized wife. You have absolutely no leverage here, Nia. Your intelligence does not matter. Your truth does not matter. The only thing that matters in this room right now is my tears. And my tears will completely bury you. Nia, I swear to God, if you do not open this door, I am going to kick it off its hinges. Marcus bellowed from the hallway. A heavy, violent thud shook the walls as he rammed his shoulder against the solid wood. Chloe, are you okay in there? Chloe, you have 5 seconds. Nia, Chloe whispered, reaching her hand back behind her to rest on the brass deadbolt. Wire the money and sign the loan, or I open the door and ruin your life permanently. 1, 2. I stood completely still behind my father's massive mahogany desk. I did not reach for my pocket to open a banking application. I did not plead with her for mercy. I did not try to physically lunge across the room to stop her from turning the lock. I simply watched her with a profound, overwhelming sense of icy calm. The frantic, violent banging outside the door, the bleeding scratches on her pale arms, the vicious, calculated racial manipulation she had just vomited at me, none of it spiked my pulse. I had spent 10 years building an impenetrable armor, and her pathetic performance could not pierce it. You have a fatal flaw, Chloe, I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension in the room like a surgical scalpel. You assume that because I have been quiet for 10 years, I have been asleep. I reached into the front pocket of my emerald silk blazer. I did not pull out a credit card or a checkbook. I pulled out my phone. The screen was bright, fully illuminated, and displaying a live high-definition video feed. I held the device up, turning the screen outward so Chloe could see it with absolute clarity. I watched her pale blue eyes dart to the glowing rectangular screen. I watched the triumphant, malicious smile slowly freeze on her face as her brain struggled to process what she was looking at. You see, when I walked into this study, I did not just open my camera app to take a few static photos of Richard's little secret files, I explained, keeping my tone entirely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than her imminent destruction. I opened a highly encrypted proprietary communication application developed by my own private equity firm. It is a secure live streaming platform specifically designed for protected corporate whistleblowing and high-level data preservation. For the last 4 minutes, my phone's front-facing camera has been broadcasting every single second of this interaction directly to a secure, unhackable cloud server. Chloe's hand dropped away from the deadbolt as if the brass metal had suddenly turned red hot. The color drained from her face so rapidly, she looked almost translucent, resembling a ghost haunting her own life. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air seemed to vanish from her lungs. The feed, I continued taking a slow, measured step toward her around the edge of the desk, is being simultaneously mirrored to 3 different remote locations. The first is my chief legal counsel's private desktop monitor. The second is an anonymous, highly monitored Dropbox at the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the third, which is my absolute personal favorite, is a direct secure link to the investigative division of the Internal Revenue Service. They are currently watching high-definition, unedited, crystal-clear footage of you violently ripping your own clothes, clawing your own arms, and explicitly detailing a calculated plan to extort me for $2 million to pay off Marcus's illegal shadow loans. They just heard you casually admit that Richard and Vivian authorized the theft of church charity funds. They heard you confess to the entire criminal conspiracy. The banging on the door suddenly stopped. Perhaps my father had gone to find a heavy tool to break the lock, or perhaps they were simply pausing to listen to the silence inside. The quiet in the study was deafening, broken only by Chloe's ragged, shallow, terrified breathing. "You wanted to play a role, Chloe?" I whispered, stepping right into her personal space. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of the blood on her arms mixing with the sickly sweet notes of her expensive perfume. You wanted to play the fragile, innocent victim destroyed by the angry black woman. But the script just got rewritten. You are not starring in a domestic soap opera anymore. You are starring in a massive federal indictment for extortion, blackmail, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And the best part is, you provided the entire confession yourself, completely unprompted, right into a federal microphone. Chloe was completely paralyzed. The malicious, arrogant woman who had tossed a catering apron at me 24 hours ago was entirely gone. The venomous manipulator who had just threatened to weaponize her white tears to put me in a cage was permanently extinguished. She was literally turned to stone, her eyes wide with a profound terror that was no longer manufactured for an audience. She was staring at the glowing red recording dot on my phone screen as if it were the barrel of a loaded gun pointed directly at her forehead. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers, imported white orchids, and the absolute elite of Atlanta's high society. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume aged scotch and the suffocating arrogance of inherited wealth. Politicians, federal judges, and corporate titans mingled in their custom-tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, sipping vintage champagne, while a live string quartet played softly in the corner. It was the ultimate display of power and prestige, a meticulously crafted illusion designed to celebrate my father's 65th birthday and solidify Marcus's highly anticipated real estate deal. I stepped through the gilded double doors wearing a custom-designed floor-length emerald silk gown. The dress was a masterpiece of architectural precision, radiating a quiet, undeniable authority. I did not look like a failure. I did not look like a woman who had been threatened with federal prison just 24 hours earlier. I looked exactly like what I secretly was, the apex predator in a room full of oblivious prey. I barely had time to take a single breath before Vivian's manicured fingers clamped down on my bare arm like a steel vise. My mother materialized out of the crowd, a frozen camera-ready smile plastered across her face, while her perfectly manicured nails dug painfully into my skin. She wore a diamond necklace that cost more than most people earned in a decade, but her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. She did not greet me. She did not compliment my appearance. She simply dragged me away from the grand entrance, pulling me roughly toward the shadows at the outer edges of the ballroom. "You have a colossal amount of nerve showing up here looking like you belong at the head table," Vivian hissed, keeping her voice pitched just low enough to avoid drawing the attention of a nearby state senator. I told you to make yourself useful in the kitchen. I did not invite you here to put on a fashion show and parade around my friends. I am a Caldwell mother, I replied, my voice perfectly calm, as I allowed her to pull me through the maze of elegantly decorated tables. I am simply dressing for the occasion. You are a stain on this family's reputation. She snapped her grip, tightening on my arm. Do you have any idea what I have endured today? I have spent the last 3 hours fielding questions from the women on my charity board. They all want to know why my daughter refuses to join the Jack and Jill Society. They want to know why you are never seen at church functions. I have to stand there and smile while they pity me for raising a sullen, ungrateful college dropout who works a miserable desk job and refuses to honor her social obligations. You make me look like a failure, Nia. You make this entire family look fractured. She abruptly stopped walking and shoved me forward. We had reached the absolute back of the massive ballroom. I looked at the table she had forced me toward. It was a tiny, cramped circle shoved violently into the darkest corner of the room. It was pushed so far back that my chair was physically touching the heavy, swinging metal doors that led directly into the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed through those doors with a tray of food, a blast of hot air smelling of industrial dish soap, roasted meat, and garbage hit the back of my neck. It was not just a bad seat. It was a calculated geographical insult. It was a physical manifestation of my place in this family. You are going to sit exactly right here, Vivian ordered, pointing a trembling diamond-adorned finger at the chair. You do not speak to the press. You do not approach the VIP section. You absolutely do not go anywhere near the governor's table. Marcus is about to secure a $30 million state grant tonight that will cement our family legacy for the next century. I will not allow your bitter, jealous disposition to ruin the most important night of your brother's life. You will sit here. You will stay entirely invisible, and you will not embarrass me. Vivian turned on her heel and marched back toward the brilliant light of the dance floor, her fake smile instantly snapping back into place as she greeted a wealthy real estate investor. I slowly pulled out the chair and sat down. I did not argue. I did not show a single ounce of humiliation. I simply smoothed the emerald silk of my gown over my knees and picked up my crystal water glass. I was completely comfortable in the shadows. It gave me the perfect vantage point to watch the execution I had carefully orchestrated. The tables immediately surrounding my dark corner were filled with the lower-tier guests. These were the distant acquaintances, the minor church officials, and the social climbers desperate to be in the same room as Richard Caldwell. They were also the loudest gossips in the city. I sat quietly taking a slow sip of my ice water and listened as the venomous whispers began to swirl around me. The older woman sitting at the table directly to my left leaned over and shielded her mouth with a sequined clutch, speaking to a retired pediatric surgeon. "Is that the Caldwell girl?" the woman whispered, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and absolute disgust. "The one who dropped out of school and had that terrible mental breakdown?" "Yes," the surgeon replied, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "Vivian was just telling me about her at the country club last week. It is a profound tragedy. A brilliant, exceptional family like the Caldwells, and she contributes absolutely nothing to their legacy. I heard she lives in a tiny, rundown apartment in the city. Richard has to pay off her landlord every single month just to keep an eviction off the public record. He spends a fortune keeping her off the streets." The woman gasped, clutching her pearls. "Marcus is an absolute saint for putting up with it. He is so generous to even allow her inside this venue tonight. I heard he actually offered to hire her as a basic receptionist at his development firm just to give her some structure, but she flatly refused. She is too proud and too lazy to do a hard day of work. She just leeches off her parents' trust fund while Marcus builds a real empire. It breaks Vivian's heart." I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. The lies were so deeply entrenched, so meticulously crafted by my parents over the last 10 years that they had become absolute social gospel. My family had painted themselves as noble, long-suffering martyrs burdened by a parasitic, ungrateful daughter. They used my fabricated failures to highlight Marcus's fabricated success. Across the room, standing on a raised, brightly lit dais, Marcus was currently holding court. He was surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy private investors and state politicians. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand, gesturing grandly with the other. He looked slightly manic, a thin sheen of nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. The freezing of his credit lines yesterday must have sent him into a blind panic, but his massive ego overrode his terror. He firmly believed he was untouchable. He believed the governor's arrival tonight would magically erase the millions he had embezzled and the millions he owed to the shadow lenders. Marcus spotted me sitting in the back corner. Instead of looking away, he raised his voice intentionally, projecting his words over the elegant music of the string quartet so the investors around him could hear every single syllable. "That is my little sister back there by the kitchen doors," Marcus said, pointing his champagne flute directly at me with a condescending, pitying smile. "We always try to include her in these high-level corporate events, gentlemen. Charity starts at home after all. She has really struggled to find her footing since she failed out of her university program, but family takes care of family. I have spent my entire career working 80-hour weeks, making sure my parents never have to worry about supporting her financially. You have to be willing to carry the dead weight if you want to keep the family tree standing strong." The politicians and investors chuckled warmly, raising their glasses to Marcus in a toast to his manufactured nobility. They looked at him and saw a generous, successful titan of industry. They saw a loving brother protecting his broken sister. I looked at him and saw a desperate, sweating fraud who was completely out of time. The first course of the dinner was served. The ballroom hummed with the sound of silver clinking against fine china and the low roar of hundreds of conversations. Waiters rushed back and forth through the swinging metal doors directly behind my chair, occasionally bumping against my shoulders in their frantic haste. I did not complain. I did not move. I waited. The speeches were scheduled to begin in exactly 10 minutes. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone awaited the arrival of Governor Sterling. Suddenly, the elegant atmosphere of the ballroom was pierced by a sharp, highly unusual disruption. The general manager of the St. Regis Hotel, a tall, severe-looking man in a flawless tuxedo, marched into the room. He was not carrying a bottle of wine or checking on the guests. He was flanked by two large, broad-shouldered hotel security guards. He looked completely frantic, his face pale and his jaw tightly clenched. He bypassed the grand VIP tables at the front of the room. He walked straight past Marcus and the wealthy investors. He marched directly toward the dark, cramped corner by the kitchen. He stopped exactly next to my chair. The conversations at the surrounding tables abruptly died. The retired surgeon and the gossiping woman froze with their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with malicious, breathless curiosity. They were clearly expecting me to be thrown out of the venue by security for causing some sort of embarrassing scene. They leaned in desperate to hear my final humiliation. Miss Caldwell, the general manager, said, his voice trembling slightly, as he pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I am incredibly sorry to interrupt your dinner service, but we have a severe immediate crisis." I slowly placed my water glass down on the table. "What is the problem?" The manager looked terrified as he gripped a heavy black leather folio in his hands. "There seems to be a catastrophic issue with the financial arrangements for tonight's gala. When your father, Judge Caldwell, booked the grand ballroom 6 months ago, he authorized a specific corporate account to be charged for the entirety of the event upon the commencement of the dinner service. That includes the venue rental, the premium open bar, the imported floral centerpieces, the specialized catering staff, and the private security detail. Everything. I assume the corporate card was declined," I stated, my voice completely devoid of surprise. The manager swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the security guards. "The account associated with Caldwell Development was not just declined, Miss Caldwell. It was completely frozen by the issuing bank this afternoon. When I approached your father at the head table just now to request an alternative method of payment, he was highly offended by the interruption. He flatly refused to provide a new credit card or a corporate check." "I see," I said, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. "And what did my father tell you to do?" He directed me straight to you, the manager said, extending his trembling hands and placing the heavy black leather folio directly onto the table right on top of my dinner plate. Your father stated clearly in front of our staff that you are the designated financial guarantor for this family. He said you would be personally handling the final balance for tonight's celebration. He was absolutely insistent that you are the only person authorized to settle this debt, and he demanded I bring the invoice to you immediately. A loud collective gasp erupted from the neighboring tables. The whispers ignited into a blazing wildfire. The guests stared at me in absolute shock and twisted delight. They believed Richard Caldwell was finally punishing his lazy freeloading daughter by publicly humiliating her with a bill she could never possibly afford. They believed my father was publicly stripping me of my dignity, forcing me to admit my total financial ruin in front of the entire elite society of Atlanta. I looked down at the black leather folio resting on my plate. I reached out and slowly opened the cover. The itemized invoice stretched across 3 long, detailed pages. I let my eyes trace the numbers all the way down to the bold black ink at the bottom of the final page. The total balance due immediately was $385,000. My father had set a brilliant, vicious trap. He knew Marcus's development accounts were frozen. He knew the shadow lenders were closing in, and the family was entirely out of cash. He had intentionally transferred the financial liability of this massive opulent gala directly to my name. He wanted to force me into a blinding public panic. He wanted me to be so terrified of being arrested for defrauding a luxury hotel that I would run crying to the head table begging for his mercy, completely willing to sign whatever predatory loans he demanded just to save myself from going to jail. I closed the leather folio. I looked past the nervous manager, past the whispering guests, and stared directly across the massive, sparkling ballroom. Richard Caldwell was sitting at the head table watching me. A smug, victorious, deeply arrogant smile was spread wide across his face. He raised his crystal glass of expensive scotch, pointing it directly at me from across the room in a silent, mocking toast. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He believed he had finally broken me. I did not break eye contact with Richard Caldwell. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up the heavy black leather folio from my dinner plate. The general manager of the St. Regis Hotel stood frozen next to my chair, his face pale, waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces. He expected me to weep, to hyperventilate, to beg for a phone to call my bank. Instead, I stood up. The emerald silk of my custom gown fell perfectly into place around my silhouette. I handed my crystal water glass to a passing waiter and began to walk. I stepped out of the dark, cramped corner by the kitchen doors and moved directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not walk with the hurried, panicked steps of a victim. I walked with the slow, measured cadence of an executioner. The retired pediatric surgeon and the gossiping woman to my left immediately fell silent, their eyes wide as saucers as they watched me glide past them. The entire ballroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. The soft music from the string quartet was drowned out by the rustle of expensive fabrics and the sharp intake of breath from hundreds of guests who realized the family outcast was marching straight into forbidden territory. The VIP dais was elevated 2 steps above the rest of the ballroom. It was a fortress of white orchids and silver candelabras, heavily guarded by the invisible shield of extreme wealth. Richard sat at the exact center, flanked by local politicians, state senators, and the wealthiest private equity investors in Atlanta. Marcus stood to his right, his face already flushing with angry color as he saw me approaching. Vivian was seated to Richard's left, and the moment she saw me step onto the raised platform, her polite, camera-ready smile instantly transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. I did not stop at the edge of their sacred circle. I walked directly past a state senator, ignoring his confused expression, and stopped dead center in front of my father. I raised my hand and dropped the black leather folio directly onto the center of his pristine gold-rimmed dinner plate. The heavy folder hit the fine china with a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the surrounding tables. Several investors jumped in their seats. Having a problem with the catering arrangements, Nia, my father asked. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his scotch, completely unbothered by the loud noise. His voice was laced with a thick, suffocating arrogance. He was performing for the politicians sitting next to him, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch, dealing with an unstable, hysterical child. I am not having a problem at all, Richard, I replied, deliberately using his first name. The disrespect hung in the air like a drawn blade. But the general manager seems to be under the highly delusional impression that I am responsible for your $385,000 bar tab. Vivian bolted up from her chair, her diamond necklace flashing under the lights. She grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging fiercely into my skin. Have you lost your absolute mind? She hissed, her voice, a frantic, venomous whisper, meant only for my ears. The governor is walking through those doors in less than 5 minutes. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire regional board. Get back to your table this instant before I have security drag you out the service elevator. I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the sheer, freezing temperature of my gaze and slowly released her grip. You wanted me to pay for the party, Mother, I said, keeping my voice loud enough for the investors at the table to hear every word. I am simply trying to understand why the prominent, successful Caldwell family is attempting to force a college dropout to cover the cost of their own gala. Marcus stepped forward, stepping between me and the investors, attempting to physically block their view of me. He flashed a tight, desperate smile at the surrounding VIPs before turning his glare on me. Stop making a scene, Nia, he ordered, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. You have lived off this family for years. You eat our food, you live in the properties Dad subsidizes for you. It is a simple family contribution. Do not throw a tantrum just because you are too broke to handle a basic societal obligation. I looked at my brother, taking in his sweating forehead and his perfectly tailored unpaid-for suit. You are projecting again, Marcus. I am not the one hiding from shadow lenders, and I am certainly not the one who froze the Caldwell Development corporate accounts this afternoon. Marcus went completely rigid. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse. The investors sitting at the table instantly stopped murmuring. They leaned in, their predatory business instincts suddenly activated by the mention of frozen corporate accounts. Watch your mouth! Richard slammed his glass down on the table. The sharp sound cut through the rising tension. He leaned forward, dropping the benevolent patriarch act entirely. His eyes were cold, flat, and merciless. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are out of your depth, Nia. You are going to take that folio, you are going to walk over to the general manager, and you are going to sign the financial guarantor documents right now. If you do not settle this hotel invoice immediately, I will personally instruct the manager to have you arrested for felony theft of services. You have no money, you have no power, you have nothing but the charity I allow you to have. Now handle the bill or go to jail. He stared at me, waiting for my spirit to break. He waited for the fear to wash over my face. He waited for me to realize that I was a small, insignificant piece on his grand chessboard. I turned my back on my father. I looked past Marcus and locked eyes with the general manager, who had nervously followed me up to the VIP dais and was currently hovering near the edge of the platform, flanked by his 2 security guards. Do you have your portable payment terminal? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. The manager blinked, startled by my sudden shift in focus. Yes, Miss Caldwell, I have it right here. He held up a sleek black digital card reader, his hands still trembling slightly. Bring it to me. Vivian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. What exactly do you think you're going to do, Nia? Are you going to put $300,000 on a debit card? You are making a complete fool of yourself. The entire room is watching you humiliate this family. I ignored her. I unclasped my small architectural silk clutch. I did not pull out a standard bank card. I did not pull out a platinum or gold credit card. I reached 2 fingers inside and pulled out a solid, matte black card. It was heavier than plastic, forged from anodized titanium. It had no bank logo, no visible account numbers on the front, and no spending limit. It was a card issued exclusively by private wealth institutions to individuals whose liquid assets exceeded 9 figures. I held the heavy metal card out to the general manager. He stared at it for a fraction of a second before his professional training kicked in. He stepped forward, took the titanium card with both hands, and slid it into the side of the digital terminal. The entire VIP table watched in breathless, agonizing silence. Marcus was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, a deep scowl settling over his features, convinced that the machine was about to flash a bright red declined message. He was waiting for the final humiliating punchline. The digital terminal beeped softly. A tiny green checkmark illuminated the screen. Approved. The machine whirred to life, printing a long white paper receipt. The manager took the receipt and glanced down at the printed text to verify the signature line. I watched the exact moment the general manager's brain processed the information printed in bold black ink at the very top of the receipt. It was not a personal name. It was the name of the corporate entity that held the primary account. The manager's eyes widened to the size of saucers. He stopped breathing. He looked up from the small slip of paper and stared at me as if I had just descended from the ceiling wrapped in flames. His hands began to shake so violently that the receipt fluttered in his grip. He did not just hand the card back to me. He took a full step backward, lowered his head and bowed deeply, bending at the waist in a profound display of absolute terrified submission. My deepest, most sincere apologies for the interruption, Madam CEO. The manager stammered, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire dais and out into the surrounding ballroom. The payment for $385,000 has been successfully processed in full. I had absolutely no idea we were hosting the executive leadership of Obsidian Capital this evening. Please let me know if you require anything else. Anything at all. The silence that fell over the VIP table was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Richard Caldwell slowly lowered his arms. His jaw went completely slack. Marcus staggered backward, bumping hard against the table, sending a silver fork crashing to the floor. The name hit them like a physical blast of concussive force. Obsidian Capital, the Shadowlenders, the ruthless private equity firm that held Marcus's $5 million fraudulent debt. The faceless, terrifying institution that was currently threatening to seize the Caldwell estate, liquidate their assets, and send them all to federal prison. They had spent 10 years treating me like a pathetic, invisible outcast. They had convinced the entire city that I was a failure. They never bothered to check who actually owned the debt that was keeping them awake at night. I took my titanium card back from the trembling manager and slipped it smoothly into my clutch. I turned my gaze back to my father, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "Enjoy your dinner, Richard," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silence of the room. "Because tomorrow morning I am foreclosing on your entire life." The crystal glass slipped from my father's numb fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany table and shattered, sending a spray of expensive amber liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He did not even blink. He just kept staring at me, his chest heaving as the oxygen seemed to evaporate from his lungs. The great Judge Caldwell, the man who had dictated my worth my entire life, was entirely speechless. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer just quiet. It was a suffocating, electrifying vacuum. Hundreds of the most influential people in Atlanta were holding their collective breath. The whispers that had previously mocked me as a destitute failure were completely extinguished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization. The socialites, the politicians, the real estate moguls, they were all looking at the black titanium card in my hand, and then looking at the ash-white faces of my family. Vivian broke the paralysis first. She lunged forward, her diamond necklace swinging wildly as she grabbed the edge of the table. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice a frantic, breathless rasp. "What kind of trick is this, Naya? You do not work for a private equity firm. You process paperwork. You live in a subsidized apartment. You are lying. You stole that card." I looked down at my mother. Her perfectly coiffed hair was practically vibrating with panic. "I own the firm, Mother," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, calm resonance. I built Obsidian Capital 5 years ago. I am the shadow lender you have been terrified of. I am the institution that has been keeping your golden boy afloat while he bled your retirement accounts dry. And no, I do not live in a subsidized apartment. I own the building. I own the entire block. I simply allowed you to believe your lies because it kept you from asking for my money. Vivian stumbled backward as if I had physically struck her. She looked at Richard for confirmation, but my father was still staring at the shattered glass on the table, the reality of his total financial ruin crushing him in real time. That is impossible, Marcus snarled, stepping around the table. His voice was too loud, entirely devoid of its usual smooth political cadence. He was sweating profusely, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You are a dropout," Marcus shouted, taking another step closer, his eyes wild and manic. "You failed out of your degree program. You had a mental breakdown. Mom and Dad had to pay your rent just to keep you off the streets. You are a fraud. You hacked into their system. You stole someone else's identity to get that card." The desperation pouring off him was pathetic. He was unraveling right in front of his precious investors. The men in bespoke suits, who had been toasting his brilliance just 10 minutes ago, were now subtly backing away from the dais, putting physical distance between themselves and the imploding Caldwell family. "I did not have a mental breakdown, Marcus," I stated, stepping directly into his path, so he was forced to look down into my eyes. "I dropped out of my degree program because Richard and Vivian drained my college trust fund to pay for your first 3 failed business ventures. They sacrificed my education to cover your incompetence. I spent my 20s working 3 jobs, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and building an investment portfolio from absolutely nothing. I built an empire while you were busy playing a visionary developer with stolen money." "You shut your mouth!" he yelled, spit flying from his lips. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, the cellist lowering his bow in shock. The entire room was now watching us. "Why should I asked, my voice rising, filling the cavernous space with absolute clarity. "Should I stay quiet about the $5 million you owe my firm? Should I stay quiet about the fraudulent bridge loan you tried to force me to sign today? Or should I tell your lovely investors here about the $2 million you embezzled from the Grace Fellowship Church Charity Fund to cover your tracks?" A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The regional church directors, seated near the front row, stood up from their chairs in sheer horror. Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched wail and covered her face with her hands. "I have the ledgers, Marcus." I continued, mercilessly driving the final nail into his coffin. "I have the forged bank statements. I have the video confession from your lovely wife Chloe detailing exactly how you and Richard orchestrated the entire federal crime. It has already been transmitted to the FBI and the IRS. Your legacy is dead. Your company is dead. You are going to prison, and I am going to buy this estate at auction for pennies on the dollar." Marcus lost his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, charming heir apparent completely disintegrated, leaving only a violent, cornered animal. His eyes bulged bloodshot and filled with a murderous rage. He realized in that exact second that he had 0 leverage, 0 power, and 0 escape. The sister he had mocked, belittled, and threatened to destroy had just publicly executed him. He lunged at me. "You are nothing but worthless scum. You are garbage." He roared, his voice cracking into a guttural scream that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "You do not belong here. You have never belonged here." He pulled his right arm back and swung with his entire body weight. The heavy, open-palmed strike connected solidly with the side of my face. The sheer force of the blow snapped my head to the side, sending a blinding flash of white light across my vision. The impact threw me entirely off balance. My high heels slipped on the polished marble step of the dais, and I crashed hard onto the ballroom floor. I hit the ground with a sickening thud, the breath knocked entirely out of my lungs. The beautiful emerald silk of my gown tangled around my legs. A sharp, stinging pain radiated across my cheekbone, and the metallic taste of blood instantly filled my mouth, where my teeth had cut into the inside of my cheek. A chaotic chorus of screams and panicked shouts erupted from the crowd. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as guests scrambled backward. Marcus stood over me, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked down at me with absolute, unrestrained hatred. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You are a parasite," he spat, pointing down at me as I lay on the cold floor. "You are a bitter, jealous outcast trying to ruin your own family because you could never measure up. I will destroy you for this. I will make sure you rot." I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my head spinning slightly. I touched my cheek, my fingers coming away stained with bright red blood. I did not cry. I did not cower. I looked up at him from the floor, tasting the blood in my mouth, and smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. He had just assaulted me in front of 300 witnesses. He had just sealed his own fate. The screaming in the room suddenly died. It was not a gradual fading of noise, but an instantaneous, shocking silence that swept over the crowd like a heavy wave. The panicked murmurs vanished. The guests who had been rushing forward to intervene froze dead in their tracks. Every single person in the grand ballroom turned their heads toward the back of the room. The massive gilded double doors at the main entrance had just swung open. The heavy brass handles hit the walls with a loud, definitive crash that echoed through the silent space. Governor Sterling stepped across the threshold. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo, a frozen smile of political greeting dying instantly on his lips as he took in the scene. He was flanked by 4 massive state troopers, their hands instinctively moving toward their utility belts. Behind them, a horde of flash photography erupted as the local press corps pushed their way into the ballroom, cameras rolling, capturing every single detail of the disastrous tableau. They captured the shattered glass on the VIP table. They captured my mother sobbing into her hands. They captured Marcus red-faced and sweating, standing with clenched fists. And they captured me, the bleeding, bruised woman sitting on the marble floor in a torn designer gown. The flashbulb strobed like lightning, illuminating Marcus's total destruction. Marcus blinked against the blinding glare of the cameras. The physical exertion of striking me had left him momentarily breathless, but the sudden arrival of the most powerful politician in the state acted like a violent electrical shock to his system. He looked at the governor, looked at the press corps, and his fractured mind made a desperate, catastrophic leap in logic. He actually believed this was his moment of triumph. He believed the governor had brought the media to the St. Regis to publicly announce the $30 million state grant and crown Caldwell Development as the savior of Atlanta. Marcus smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo with shaking hands. He stepped completely over my legs as I sat on the marble floor, treating me as nothing more than an obstacle in his path. He plastered on his signature charismatic smile, a terrifyingly rapid shift from the violent abuser he had been just seconds prior. He rushed down the steps of the VIP dais, his arms open wide, practically sprinting toward the entrance. "Governor Sterling, what an absolute honor!" Marcus called out, his voice projecting over the chaotic snapping of the camera shutters. He pushed past a few stunned socialites and extended his right hand, the same hand he had just used to strike me. "We have been expecting you, sir. I am Marcus Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Development. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am that you brought the press to finalize the urban renewal grant tonight. This partnership is going to change the entire landscape of this city." Governor Sterling did not smile. He did not slow his pace, and he absolutely did not reach out to take my brother's extended hand. The governor stopped walking, allowing the heavy wall of armed state troopers to form a protective perimeter around him. He looked at Marcus's outstretched hand, and then slowly raised his eyes to meet my brother's frantic, sweating face. The expression on the governor's face was not merely dismissive. It was a look of profound, unadulterated disgust, the kind of look one might reserve for a piece of rotting garbage stuck to the bottom of an expensive shoe. Marcus stood there, his hands suspended in the empty air. The cameras captured the exact microsecond his manufactured confidence began to crack. The flashbulbs highlighted the stark terror bleeding back into his eyes as the horrible reality of the silence settled over the room. "Move out of my way, Mr. Caldwell," the governor said. His voice was quiet, icy, and carried the crushing weight of absolute authority. Without waiting for a response, the governor stepped entirely around my brother. He left Marcus standing alone in the middle of the ballroom floor, his hand still foolishly extended toward nothing, while the press corps relentlessly photographed his public humiliation. Governor Sterling walked straight past the whispering crowd, straight past the frozen politicians at the front tables, and marched directly toward the VIP dais. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Vivian. He walked straight to where I was sitting on the cold marble floor. He reached down, extending his hand to me. I took it. His grip was firm and respectful. He pulled me up effortlessly, steadying me as I regained my balance on my high heels. I brushed the dust from my torn emerald silk gown and wiped the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand, smearing a streak of bright red blood across my knuckles. "Are you all right, Madam Chairman?" the governor asked, his voice completely stripped of its political polish, replaced by genuine concern. I apologize for the delay. My security detail was attempting to clear the perimeter before we entered, but we heard the commotion. "I am perfectly fine, Governor," I replied, my voice steady, projecting clearly across the dead silent ballroom. "It takes significantly more than a temper tantrum to keep me on the floor." The sound of the governor addressing me with such profound deference sent a shockwave of utter bewilderment through the crowd. The wealthy investors who had been backing away from the dais suddenly stopped. The gossiping socialites in the back corners strained their necks, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. My father finally snapped out of his paralysis. The sight of the governor helping his disgraced outcast daughter off the floor short-circuited his brain. He rushed forward, his face flushed an angry, volatile purple. "Governor Sterling, there has been a terrible misunderstanding here," Richard boomed, attempting to assert his patriarchal dominance over the situation. "My daughter is deeply unwell. She is having a severe mental episode. We are currently trying to handle this private family matter. If you would just step aside, I will have security escort her to a medical facility, and we can proceed with the business of the evening. We have a grant to finalize." Governor Sterling turned his head slowly. He looked at my father with the same chilling contempt he had shown Marcus. He let his gaze sweep over Richard, then over Vivian, who was trembling so violently her diamond necklace was shaking, and finally back to Marcus, who was slowly retreating toward the edge of the room. "Do you people really not know who she is?" the governor asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was laced with absolute mocking disbelief. Richard blinked, completely derailed by the question. "She is my daughter. She is a college dropout who processes paperwork. She has nothing to do with Caldwell Development or the state grant." The governor let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He turned his back on my father and faced the sea of journalists and cameras that were currently broadcasting this entire spectacle live across the state. "Let me be entirely clear," the governor announced, his voice booming through the grand space. "There seems to be a massive, fraudulent misconception circulating in this room regarding the downtown urban renewal project. Caldwell Development has been publicly claiming that the state is providing a $30 million taxpayer grant to fund their construction. That is a complete and utter lie." The gasps from the investors at the surrounding tables were audible. Marcus physically swayed on his feet, reaching out to grip the back of an empty chair to keep himself from collapsing. "The state of Georgia is not putting a single dime of taxpayer money into Caldwell Development." The governor continued, twisting the knife. "The state simply agreed to facilitate the zoning permits completely contingent on Caldwell Development, securing private third-party financial backing. We required them to find a solitary corporate guarantor with the liquid capital necessary to underwrite the entire $30 million project." The governor turned slightly, gesturing respectfully toward me. That private backing, the governor declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality, was secured through Titanium Capital, the parent investment fund of Obsidian Capital. It is the largest, most aggressive, and most heavily capitalized private equity fund in the entire American South. He paused, letting the immense weight of the financial institutions settle over the room. My parents looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from their lungs. "And this woman," the governor said, looking directly at my father, "is not a paperwork processor. Nia Caldwell is the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole managing partner of Titanium Capital. She personally controls every single cent of the funding for the urban renewal project. She is the solitary signature on the contracts. She is the only reason Caldwell Development has not already been liquidated by the federal government. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a 40-year dynasty instantly turning to dust. Richard Caldwell staggered backward, his knees giving out. He fell heavily into his leather chair at the head table, staring at me with eyes completely devoid of comprehension. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded my submission, who had tried to force me to sign predatory shadow loans, was now looking at the very architect of his destruction. He realized that the mysterious, terrifying shadow lenders who had been threatening to seize his estate and throw his son in federal prison were not faceless corporate sharks. It was me. I was the lender. I was the debt collector. Vivian let out a choked, desperate sob. She looked at the torn, bloody silk of my dress, the dress she had criticized, and realized she was staring at a billionaire who owned the very ground she was standing on. Marcus was entirely broken. He slid down the back of the chair he was holding, collapsing onto his knees on the ballroom floor. He wept openly, loudly, his hands covering his face as the flashbulbs illuminated his total, unmitigated ruin. The investors he had been courting just moments ago were already dialing their lawyers, desperate to sever all ties with Caldwell Development before the federal indictments dropped tomorrow morning. I stood on the dais, bleeding but victorious, looking down at the wreckage of the family that had tried to bury me. I had not just survived their cruelty. I had bought it, packaged it, and sold it back to them at a price they could never afford to pay. The blinding, relentless bursts of white light from the press cameras seemed to act as a defibrillator on Marcus's shattered psyche. For 10 agonizing seconds, he remained slumped on the cold marble floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic weight of the governor's announcement. Then a highly disturbing sound erupted from the back of his throat. It started as a low, wet gasp and quickly morphed into a loud, frantic laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of humor. It was the hysterical, fractured noise of a man whose mind was actively snapping in two. Marcus pushed himself up onto his feet, his knees visibly shaking, and aggressively wiped the sweat from his forehead. He forced his facial muscles into a wide, grotesque parody of his signature corporate smile. He turned toward the wall of journalists, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "What an incredible performance!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking and pitching dangerously high. He clapped his hands together, the sound echoing hollowly across the ballroom. "You really had me going for a second there, Nia. This is magnificent. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, let us give a massive round of applause to my little sister. She has always possessed a remarkably dark sense of humor. This is simply an elaborate stunt, a sibling prank to celebrate the signing of the state grant. There is absolutely no private equity buyout. There is no Obsidian Capital. She is a low-level clerk playing a practical joke." The silence that met his desperate declaration was absolute and damning. Not a single person in the massive ballroom laughed. Not a single journalist lowered their camera. The private investors from the head table looked at Marcus with a mixture of profound pity and acute revulsion. They recognized a drowning man grasping at invisible life preservers. Governor Sterling did not even grant Marcus the dignity of a verbal response. The governor simply turned his head, signaling his lead security detail with a subtle nod. 2 massive state troopers immediately stepped forward, placing themselves solidly between the governor and Marcus, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. The message was unmistakable. Marcus Caldwell was no longer a prominent Atlanta developer. He was a volatile threat. Seeing his golden child publicly dismissed and recognizing the undeniable reality of his own financial obliteration, Richard Caldwell made a sudden, deeply cynical calculation. My father was a man who had survived decades in the cutthroat world of real estate by ruthlessly shifting his allegiances the moment the wind changed. He looked at Marcus, abandoned and broken, and instantly discarded him. The patriarch's survival instinct kicked in, overriding any parental loyalty. He pivoted toward the only source of power left in the room. He pivoted toward me. Richard straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back and thrusting his chest forward for the benefit of the cameras. He manufactured a look of deep, overwhelming paternal pride, a completely fabricated emotion that made my stomach churn. He stepped onto the dais, moving purposefully toward me. "That is quite enough, Marcus," Richard barked, using his authoritative courtroom voice to publicly silence his son. "You are embarrassing yourself." My father turned to face the media, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of benevolent triumph. He looked directly at the flashing lenses. "What you are witnessing tonight is the culmination of decades of careful Caldwell family planning," Richard announced, his voice booming with practiced resonance. "My daughter Nia has always been a fiercely independent spirit. We kept her involvement with Titanium Capital strictly confidential to protect the integrity of the firm. But make no mistake, her brilliant success is the direct result of her elite family upbringing. She possesses the Caldwell business acumen, the relentless drive that I personally instilled in her from childhood. We taught her exactly how to conquer this industry. I could not be prouder of the empire she has built under my guidance." He stepped close to me, reaching out with both hands, intending to grab my shoulders and pull me into an embrace for the front-page photographs. He wanted the world to see the loving father and his wildly successful billionaire daughter. He wanted to claim my victory as his own. He never made contact. The moment his hands moved toward me, I stepped into his space and violently slapped his forearms away. The sound of my hand striking his wrist was sharp and resonant, cutting clearly through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Richard gasped, stumbling backward, genuine shock registering on his face. He looked at his hands, then up at me, his carefully constructed mask of paternal pride slipping to reveal the furious, humiliated man underneath. "Do not ever touch me," I said, my voice low but vibrating with lethal intensity. "You do not get to claim my empire, Richard. You do not get to use my name to salvage your pathetic reputation. You taught me absolutely nothing about business. You taught me how to survive a narcissist. You taught me that family is a liability, that loyalty is a weakness, and that the only way to protect myself was to become more powerful than you could ever possibly comprehend." I turned my back on his stunned, ashen face. I left him standing frozen on the edge of the dais and walked purposefully toward the center of the platform. A sleek, transparent acrylic podium stood there, equipped with a high-end microphone system intended for the governor's grand speech. I stepped behind the podium and gripped the edges. I leaned forward, tapping the microphone once. The sharp, amplified thump echoed from dozens of speakers mounted around the massive ballroom. Every conversation, every whisper, every rustle of fabric instantly ceased. 300 pairs of eyes were locked entirely on me. "My name is Nia Caldwell," I began, my voice amplified, steady, and commanding. "I am the founder and CEO of Titanium Capital. For the last 10 years, the people sitting at this VIP table have told you a very specific story. They told you I was a mentally unstable college dropout. They told you I was a financial parasite draining their resources. They used my fabricated failures to elevate Marcus, painting him as the noble, hardworking savior of the Caldwell dynasty." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the silent crowd. I made eye contact with the gossiping socialites, the politicians and the bankers who had spent the evening whispering about my ruined clothes and my cramped seat by the kitchen doors. "They lied to you," I stated flatly. "They drained my educational trust fund to cover Marcus's initial business failures. When I refused to participate in their corporate fraud, they banished me. I built my firm from a studio apartment while they lived in a mansion funded by predatory loans. And tonight, Caldwell Development is officially insolvent. Their corporate accounts are frozen. They have zero liquid assets. They are entirely dependent on a $30 million lifeline from my firm." A low murmur ran through the crowd, the undeniable thrill of witnessing a high society execution. "But simple bankruptcy is not the reason I brought you all here tonight," I continued, my voice cutting through the noise like a scythe. "Incompetence is a tragedy, but it is not a crime. What Marcus Caldwell has done over the last 18 months goes far beyond bad business management." I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. I held it up for the cameras to see. I turned to the audiovisual technicians stationed at the soundboard in the back corner of the room. I gave them a sharp, definitive nod. The technicians immediately sprang into action. The elegant ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed drastically. Behind me, spanning the entire back wall of the VIP dais, three massive high-definition projection screens hummed to life. Previously, they had been displaying the gold and navy logo of Caldwell Development. Now the screens flashed blindingly white. I plugged the flash drive into the port on the podium. I pressed a single button on the control panel. The image that appeared on the three massive screens behind me was not a marketing presentation. It was a high-resolution, meticulously scanned copy of a certified bank ledger. The document was highly classified, stamped with the official seals of both the IRS and a major federal banking institution. I want you all to direct your attention to the screens, I commanded, stepping aside so the entire room had an unobstructed view. The crowd gasped. Several people physically recoiled. The regional directors of the Grace Fellowship Church seated in the front row let out cries of absolute horror. Vivian Caldwell screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of total devastation. She collapsed entirely, her knees hitting the marble floor, her hands tearing at her perfectly styled hair. What you are looking at is the master ledger for the Grace Fellowship Church Regional Charity Fund. I announced, my voice echoing relentlessly over Vivian's sobbing. A fund dedicated to building low-income housing and providing disaster relief across the state. A fund overseen by a board of directors that includes my mother and my father. I pressed a button, advancing to the next slide. The screen zoomed in on a specific series of transaction columns, highlighting them in bright, unmistakable yellow. If you look closely at the highlighted transfers dating from March of last year to the present day, you will see a highly systematic, deliberate funneling of cash, I explained, walking the audience through the evidence like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. You will see exactly $2 million moved out of the church's tax-exempt charity accounts. Those funds were moved through three separate offshore shell companies. I advanced to the final slide. It showed the ultimate destination of the stolen money. It was a direct routing number to a private corporate account. And this final document, I concluded, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register that forced everyone to strain to hear, proves exactly where that $2 million ended up. It did not go to low-income housing. It did not go to disaster relief. It went directly into the private operating accounts of Caldwell Development. Marcus Caldwell did not just mismanage his company. He orchestrated a massive federal wire fraud scheme. He stole $2 million from a church charity fund to cover his illegal debts, and his parents used their board positions to authorize the transfers. The ballroom exploded. It was total, unmitigated chaos. The press corps surged forward, shouting questions, their cameras firing wildly at the screens and then at my family. The church directors were yelling for their lawyers. The politicians were frantically backing away from the dais, desperate to avoid being photographed anywhere near my father. Marcus was curled into a fetal position on the floor, weeping hysterically, his hands covering his ears as if he could physically block out the sound of his life ending. Richard stood frozen, his face devoid of blood, staring at the projected bank statements that guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. I stood at the podium, perfectly still amidst the screaming and the flashing lights. I looked down at the people who had tried to destroy me, the family that had called me a parasite and a failure. Their facade was completely shattered. Their wealth was gone. Their freedom was gone. I had promised to bring them the absolute truth, and the truth had just burned their empire to the ground. The massive projection screens cast a harsh, unforgiving blue light across the St. Regis ballroom. The highlighted yellow columns of the bank ledger burned into the retinas of every prominent figure in Atlanta. For 10 agonizing seconds, the sheer magnitude of the theft paralyzed the crowd. Then the shock fractured into pure explosive outrage. The sophisticated veneer of the black tie gala instantly dissolved into the chaotic acoustics of a tribunal. The regional directors of the Grace Fellowship Church, men and women who had dined at my parents' table and publicly blessed their business ventures, were the first to break the silence. Reverend Thomas, a man who had known our family for 30 years and had personally baptized Marcus, stepped out of the front row. His face was flushed with a terrifying mix of grief and absolute fury. He pointed a trembling hand at the projected routing numbers on the screen behind me, his eyes darting frantically between the undeniable mathematical proof and my father's frozen, bloodless face. $2 million! The Reverend shouted, his voice cracking with betrayal. You sat in our sanctuary, Richard. You prayed with us. You promised that money was going to build shelters for families who had lost absolutely everything in the coastal hurricanes. You took bread from the mouths of the destitute to fund your son's corporate vanity projects. The outrage rippled outward, infecting the politicians and private investors who realized their own reputations were now mortally compromised by simply being in the same room as the Caldwells. Wealthy socialites who had spent the last decade treating Vivian Caldwell like royalty were now openly backing away from the dais, lifting their silk gowns to avoid brushing against the contaminated ground. The murmurs turned into shouting. The shouting turned into a deafening roar of condemnation. Vivian Caldwell did what she had done her entire life when confronted with the ugly, undeniable truth. She violently rejected reality. She snapped out of her paralyzed state on the marble floor. She scrambled to her feet, her breathing erratic and shallow. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her heavy diamond earrings swung wildly against her neck. She marched to the front of the dais, placing herself between the furious church directors and her disgraced husband. "Do not listen to her!" Vivian screamed, her voice a shrill, desperate screech that completely shattered her carefully cultivated high society persona. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "She is a liar. She has always been a sick, vindictive liar." The crowd fell into a stunned, breathless hush, captivated by the spectacle of the Caldwell matriarch losing her mind on live television. The local press corps aggressively zoomed their lenses in on Vivian's frantic, sweating face. "She forged these documents!" Vivian continued, her voice growing increasingly hysterical as she paced the edge of the platform. "She is a bitter, jealous outcast. She dropped out of college. She failed at everything she ever attempted, and she has spent the last 10 years obsessed with destroying this family because she could never measure up to Marcus. My son is a brilliant developer. My husband is a pillar of this community. This so-called ledger is a complete digital fabrication. She hired someone to hack these screens. It is a pathetic, desperate attempt to steal our legacy." She turned pleadingly to the crowd, extending her hands toward the wealthy women she had played tennis with just yesterday. "You all know me. You know Richard. You know we would never touch church funds. She is trying to ruin the most important night of my son's life because she is a miserable, solitary failure. Look at her. She does not even belong in this room." I did not flinch. I did not step away from the acrylic podium. I simply looked down at my mother with clinical freezing detachment. Her defense was so inherently pathetic, so detached from the glaring federal seals projected behind me, that it required no verbal rebuttal. I let her drown in the silence of her former friends. Not a single person in the ballroom stepped forward to defend her. Not a single politician nodded in agreement. They just stared at her with absolute disgust. And then the final fatal crack in the Caldwell family armor splintered wide open. Chloe Caldwell Marcus's pristine, blonde, perfectly curated wife had been standing near the edge of the VIP tables. She was wearing a custom couture gown purchased with the very funds her husband had embezzled. She had stood by Marcus's side for years, perfectly content to spend stolen money, completely willing to look the other way, as long as her credit cards cleared and her social status remained intact. But Chloe was above all things an apex survivalist. She looked at the giant screens displaying the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud. She looked at the armed state troopers flanking Governor Sterling. She looked at the press corps documenting every second of the implosion. Her razor-sharp self-preservation instincts instantly calculated her odds. The Caldwell ship was not just sinking, it had already hit the ocean floor. If she stayed loyal to Marcus, she was going to federal prison as an accessory to fraud. Chloe made her choice. She dropped her expensive crystal clutch. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter. She took 3 steps forward, moving directly into the center of the blinding camera flashes. She did not just cry, she collapsed. Chloe fell heavily onto her knees right in the middle of the St. Regis ballroom. She threw her hands over her face and let out a loud, theatrical, deeply agonizing sob. The sound was so raw, so perfectly pitched for maximum sympathy, that it immediately commanded the attention of the entire room. "It is true," Chloe wailed, pulling her hands away to reveal a face drenched in carefully managed tears. Her voice echoed off the walls, completely drowning out Vivian's frantic denials. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Vivian gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "Shut your mouth immediately. I cannot lie for him anymore," Chloe cried, turning her tear-stained face directly toward Governor Sterling and the press cameras. "I cannot carry this terrible burden for another second. He lied to me. He lied to all of us." Marcus, who had been huddled in a state of catatonic shock on the floor, suddenly jerked his head up. He stared at his wife as if she had just morphed into a terrifying, unrecognizable monster. Chloe pointed a trembling, dramatic finger directly at Marcus. "He told me the church money was a private, completely legal bridge loan. He told me Richard authorized the transfer through the regional board. I saw the bank statements on his desk 3 months ago. When I asked him why Caldwell Development was receiving money from Grace Fellowship, he screamed at me. He told me to keep my mouth shut and mind my own business." "You treacherous, lying bitch," Marcus hissed, his voice a low, venomous rattle. He was drowning in debt. Chloe continued raising her voice to ensure every single journalist captured her confession. He was receiving threatening phone calls from shadow lenders at all hours of the night. He was terrified. He said the state grant tonight was the only thing that would keep him out of jail. He forced me to smile and pretend everything was fine. I was so scared of him. He manipulated me, and he manipulated this entire city. Nia is telling the absolute truth. Every single number on that screen is real. The betrayal was absolute. It was a flawless, devastating internal execution. Chloe had completely severed herself from the Caldwell name, throwing her husband and her parents-in-law directly into the incinerator to secure her own immunity. The model family, the untouchable Atlanta dynasty, was cannibalizing itself live on camera, Marcus snapped. The human mind can only process a finite amount of catastrophic trauma before the rational centers completely shut down. In the span of 10 minutes, Marcus had lost his company, his wealth, his freedom, his reputation, and now his wife had publicly handed him over to the federal government. The golden child was entirely gone. Only a violent, unrestrained sociopath remained. He let out a guttural, terrifying roar. It was the sound of a cornered predator realizing it was about to die. Marcus scrambled off the floor. He did not run for the exit. He lunged directly at Chloe. He crossed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. Before anyone could react, before the guests could even scream, Marcus threw himself on top of his kneeling wife. He tackled her backward onto the polished marble floor. His hands, heavy and brutal, clamped directly around Chloe's throat. "I will kill you!" he screamed, his face entirely twisted into a mask of homicidal rage. His thumbs dug savagely into her windpipe. "You ruined my life. You ruined everything. I am going to kill you." Chloe thrashed wildly beneath him, her hands tearing frantically at his wrists, her face rapidly turning a terrifying shade of crimson as he choked the life out of her. The ballroom erupted into absolute bedlam. Guests screamed in genuine terror, knocking over tables and shattering centerpieces as they scrambled to get away from the violent assault. The governor's security detail did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The 4 massive state troopers trained for immediate, overwhelming physical intervention swarmed the dais. They hit Marcus like a freight train. 2 troopers grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, violently ripping his hands away from Chloe's throat. A 3rd trooper drove a heavy combat boot directly into the back of Marcus's knee, buckling his leg and forcing him downward. The 4th trooper grabbed the back of Marcus's tailored tuxedo jacket and shoved him face first into the marble floor with bone-jarring force. The sound of Marcus's skull hitting the ground echoed sharply above the screaming crowd. "Do not move a single muscle," a trooper roared, pressing his full body weight into the center of Marcus's back. Marcus thrashed like a wild animal, spitting blood and cursing blindly, trying desperately to buck the heavy officers off his back. But it was entirely useless. A trooper grabbed Marcus's arms, twisting them painfully behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, echoed through the room, signifying the absolute, undeniable end of Marcus Caldwell. Chloe lay gasping and coughing on the floor, surrounded by terrified socialites. Vivian was collapsed against the wall, wailing uncontrollably. Richard stood paralyzed, watching his son being crushed into the floor by law enforcement. I remained standing behind the acrylic podium. I looked down at the chaotic, pathetic ruin of my family. I looked at Marcus, the golden boy, his face smashed against the floor, his hands bound in steel right in the middle of his own black tie gala. The music was dead, the empire was dead, and I had never felt more alive. The heavy brass-studded oak doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind the state troopers, severing Marcus Caldwell from the high society world he had so desperately tried to conquer. The muffled sounds of his frantic, animalistic screaming faded down the long velvet corridor, leaving behind a ballroom vibrating with a highly toxic, paralyzed shock. Richard Caldwell stared at those closed doors for a long, ragged moment. His chest heaved beneath his tailored tuxedo shirt. The man who had spent his entire life controlling every variable, every narrative, and every person in his orbit had just watched his golden child led away in steel handcuffs. The illusion of the perfect Caldwell dynasty had not just cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. Slowly, Richard pivoted on his heel. His face, usually a mask of smug patrician superiority, was flushed a dark, volatile purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk bow tie. He turned his fury away from the closed doors and locked his blazing eyes entirely on me. He marched toward the dais, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply in the dead, silent room. "Turn those screens off right this second," Richard bellowed. He used the booming, authoritative boardroom voice that had terrified his employees and his family for decades. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "Turn them off and tell these people this is a lie. Are you trying to destroy the Caldwell name? Are you trying to burn down everything I have built? You insolent, ungrateful wretch. You owe me your life. You owe me everything you are." I did not touch the control panel. The federal bank ledger remained projected in blinding white light against the back wall, a digital monument to his monumental failure. I stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium. My emerald silk gown rustled loudly as I descended the 3 steps of the VIP dais. I moved deliberately, taking my time until I stood on the polished marble floor, less than 2 feet away from the towering patriarch of the Caldwell family. For my entire life, Richard had used his physical size to intimidate me. He had stood over me, invading my space, using his towering height to force me to shrink, to apologize, to submit. He tried to do it now. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, leaning his heavy frame over me, attempting to cast a shadow of patriarchal dominance. I did not shrink. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eyes, holding my ground with absolute freezing stillness. "I owe you my life," I repeated. The words tasted like ash, but my voice remained perfectly level, carrying effortlessly across the silent, watching crowd. "Let us talk about what I owe you, Richard. Let us talk about the exact mathematics of my debt to this family." Richard's jaw worked furiously, but he could not find the words to interrupt the sheer absolute authority radiating from my posture. When I was 18 years old, I received an acceptance letter to the Wharton School of Business. I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. It was the only thing I had ever worked for. "You walked into my bedroom, took the letter from my hands, and tore it in half. You told me business was a man's game. You told me that my college trust fund was being reallocated to cover Marcus's first catastrophic real estate failure. You stole $200,000 from my future to buy your son a second chance he absolutely did not deserve." "That was family money!" Richard hissed, his spit flying in my face. "I made that money. I get to decide where it goes." "You were a naive girl. Marcus was an investment in our legacy." "Marcus was a black hole," I corrected coldly. "But let us continue the accounting. When I was 22, working 3 miserable jobs to pay for night classes, you summoned me to your corporate office. You did not ask how I was surviving. You slammed a stack of loan documents on your desk, and demanded I co-sign a high-interest commercial note because Marcus had bankrupted his second company and your personal credit was completely overextended. You told me it was my biological duty as a daughter to absorb his financial ruin. Richard opened his mouth to shout to drown me out with his booming volume, but I stepped closer, forcing him to physically lean back to maintain his balance. When I refused to sign away my life to save his, you told me I was dead to you. I continued, the memories fueling the icy calm in my chest. You changed the locks on my childhood home. You instructed the security guards at your corporate headquarters to treat me as a hostile trespasser. 5 years ago, I drafted the initial architectural and financial proposal for this very downtown urban renewal project. I left it on your desk as a peace offering. You took my blueprints, you erased my name, you slapped Marcus's name on the cover, and you presented it to the city council as his brilliant vision. You stole my intellect to prop up his staggering incompetence. You are insane, Richard shouted, turning frantically toward the surrounding crowd, desperate to recruit allies. He threw his arms out wide, gesturing to the wealthy investors who were actively backing away from him. Do not listen to her. She is a hysterical, bitter woman. She has always been deeply unwell. She is making this up to humiliate us because she could never measure up to her brother. I gave her clothes. I gave her food. Everything she has is because she carries my last name. Not a single person in the ballroom came to his defense. The politicians stared at him with unvarnished disgust. The regional bank directors looked at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. Richard Caldwell was completely, utterly isolated. The realization hit him, and for the first time in his arrogant life, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. I do not carry your name in the boardroom, Richard, I said quietly, dragging his attention back to me. Titanium Capital knows me as Nia Sterling. I dropped your toxic legacy the moment I left your house. I owe you absolutely nothing, but you owe me everything. I turned my back on his stunned face and walked toward the main VIP dining table. A thick black leather portfolio rested exactly where I had left it near my empty chair. I picked up the heavy leather folder, feeling the immense weight of the documents inside. I walked back to where Richard stood frozen on the ballroom floor. I raised the portfolio and slammed it down onto the nearest dining table. The heavy leather hit the solid wood with a violent, resounding crash. Crystal wine glasses tipped over, spilling dark red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth like fresh blood. Richard jumped, startled by the sudden violence of the noise. He stared at the black folder as if it were a live explosive device. Open it, I commanded. I am not looking at your fabricated garbage, Richard spat, crossing his arms tightly over his chest in a pathetic display of defiance. Fine, I replied smoothly. I reached down, grabbed the cover of the portfolio, and flipped it open myself. I pulled out a thick stack of aggressively stamped legal documents and spread them out across the stained tablecloth, ensuring the bold red federal seals were clearly visible to everyone nearby. For the last 5 years, you have been secretly leveraging every single personal asset you possess to keep Caldwell Development from drowning, I announced, walking the crowd through the final stage of his execution. When the commercial banks stopped lending to you, you became desperate. You took out a massive predatory secondary mortgage on the Caldwell estate on West Paces Ferry. The house with the marble columns, the heated pool, the manicured gardens where Mother hosts her charity galas. You borrowed $8 million against your own home through the Georgia Regional Bank. Vivian, who had been weeping hysterically on the floor near the podium, suddenly stopped crying. She pulled herself up, clutching the edge of a table for support. Her face was a mask of smeared mascara and absolute terror. Richard, what is she talking about? Vivian shrieked, her voice shaking violently. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not mortgage the house. That house has been in my family for 3 generations. Richard did not look at his wife. He could not tear his eyes away from the documents spread across the table. His arrogant posture completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward, and the rigid patriarchal spine that had supported his entire identity seemed to instantly dissolve. He recognized the aggressive legal formatting. He recognized his own desperate signatures on the bottom lines. Georgia Regional Bank was quietly and aggressively acquired by Obsidian Capital. Last Tuesday morning, I declared, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising finality. And as the governor so graciously confirmed earlier this evening, I am the sole managing partner and majority shareholder of Obsidian Capital. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the terrifying, breathless quiet of watching a guillotine blade drop. That means Titanium Capital owns the commercial debt that just bankrupted Caldwell Development, I explained, twisting the knife with surgical precision. But Obsidian Capital owns your personal residential debt. I bought your mortgage, Richard. I bought the very roof over your head. I own the marble floors you walk on. I own the dining room table where you used to tell me I was worthless. I own the ground beneath your expensive Italian shoes. Richard swayed on his feet. He reached out to grip the back of a chair to keep himself from falling. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollowed out by the sheer apocalyptic scale of his ruin. The wealthy, powerful tyrant was gone. Only a terrified, bankrupt old man remained. You are currently 30 days delinquent on your latest payment, I said, leaning closer to him so he could hear the absolute promise of destruction in my voice. According to the penalty clauses you signed in a desperate panic, I have the absolute legal right to accelerate the loan and demand immediate total payment in full. A payment you cannot possibly make because your corporate accounts are currently frozen by the federal government pending the wire fraud investigation. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless wail and collapsed back onto the floor, realizing her entire social existence had just been vaporized. I reached out and tapped the top page of the legal documents. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property, I announced, my voice echoing coldly across the ballroom. If you are not gone by Monday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically breach the doors, remove your belongings, and toss them onto the sidewalk for the entire neighborhood to see. You told me failures do not belong in this family. You were absolutely right. Pack your bags, Richard. You are evicted. The word evicted hung in the cavernous space of the ballroom, a death sentence for the Caldwell social dynasty. Richard remained entirely mute, his jaw slack, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. But the word shattered whatever fragile denial Vivian had left. The West Paces Ferry estate was not just a house to her, it was her armor. It was the venue for her legendary charity galas, the physical manifestation of her superiority over every other woman in Atlanta. Stripped of that mansion, she was absolutely nothing. A ragged, terrible keening sound tore from her throat. Vivian scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She did not care that her designer gown was tearing on the marble, or that the cameras were capturing her total degradation. She crawled directly toward me, abandoning her husband, abandoning the son who was currently being hauled to his feet by state troopers. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and clamped her fingers fiercely around the fabric of my dress, burying her face against my knees. "Nia, please," Vivian wailed, her voice a wet, breathless plea. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw your own mother into the street. I am your mother, Nia. I gave you life." I looked down at the woman who had spent the last 30 years treating me like a persistent, embarrassing stain on her perfect life. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled mess. Black mascara tracked heavy, dark lines down her flushed cheeks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, frantically searching my face for a vulnerability she could exploit. "I know we had our differences," Vivian sobbed, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through the silk of my dress. "But I always loved you. Deep down, I always loved you more than anything. Do you not remember when you were little? Do you not remember how I used to sit by your bed when you had a fever? How I used to brush your hair and tell you how beautiful you were? We were so close, Nia. We had a special bond. You know we did." The audacity of her lies was genuinely breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite 3 decades of emotional abuse in real-time banking on the desperate hope that a daughter's biological craving for a mother's love would override my rationality. I remembered my childhood vividly. I remembered the cold, distant stares. I remembered her telling me I was too loud, too opinionated, and too plain to ever secure a decent husband. I remembered her standing silently by while Richard and Marcus tore my self-esteem to shreds, stepping in only to complain that my crying was giving her a migraine. She was not weeping for me. She was weeping for her crystal chandeliers, her walk-in closets, and her exclusive country club memberships. She was weeping because the women she had spent her life judging were currently watching her grovel at the feet of the daughter she had thrown away. I did not yell. I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting her cling to me for one long, humiliating moment under the blinding glare of the flashbulbs. Then I slowly bent down. I leaned in close, bringing my face mere inches from her trembling, tear-soaked cheek. The ballroom was completely silent, but I pitched my voice so low that the microphone on the podium could not capture it. This message was meant exclusively for her. "Your love always came with a price tag," I whispered directly into her ear, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. And today I bought it out completely. I straightened up, my expression carved from ice. I reached down, grabbed her wrists, and effortlessly peeled her desperate fingers off my gown. I let her hands drop, stepping backward and leaving her slumped on the cold marble floor, sobbing into her empty palms. I turned my attention back to the acrylic podium, leaving my mother weeping on the marble floor. The ballroom was breathless, the heavy silence broken only by the sharp mechanical clicking of camera shutters. Governor Sterling stood near the edge of the dais, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction. He nodded at me, a silent cue to finish the execution. I leaned into the microphone. The sharp screech of audio feedback briefly pierced the air before my voice resonated through the grand space. "Governor Sterling and members of the press," I announced, my tone ringing with absolute authority. "Caldwell Development has proven itself to be a criminal enterprise built on theft and exploitation. Therefore, effective immediately, Titanium Capital is permanently severing all ties with their organization. They are officially stripped of their preferred vendor status and permanently disqualified from bidding on the downtown urban renewal project." The remaining investors at the tables hastily scribbled notes, desperately trying to salvage their own portfolios. "However, the revitalization of our city will not suffer because of one family's greed." I continued, projecting my voice over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "The $30 million in private equity funding remains fully secured, but it will not go to a dynasty that steals from the vulnerable. Tomorrow morning, I will officially award the entire development contract to the Vanguard Coalition. They are a commercial construction firm, founded, owned, and operated entirely by Black women right here in Atlanta. They have a proven track record of ethical development, and unlike my brother, they actually care about the communities they build." A spontaneous wave of applause erupted from the back of the room, led by the local journalists and city council members who had long despised my father's ruthless tactics. Richard flinched as the clapping echoed around him, the sound acting as the final nail in his professional coffin. I looked down at Marcus. The state troopers still had him pinned securely against the floor, his face smashed against the polished stone. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat. "Officers," I said, addressing the lead trooper directly. "The encrypted drive plugged into this podium contains the unredacted bank ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital signatures proving massive federal wire fraud. I believe you have everything you need." The lead trooper pulled Marcus up by the back of his collar. "Get on your feet," the officer barked, hauling my brother upright. Right on cue, the piercing wail of police sirens erupted from the street outside. The flashing red and blue lights reflected wildly against the tall glass windows of the St. Regis ballroom, casting chaotic shadows across the terrified faces of the elite guests. Backup had arrived. Marcus began to panic wildly. He thrashed against the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. "Dad!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. "Dad, do something. Call the lawyers. Do not let them take me." Richard did not move a single muscle. He stared blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the realization that his own impending indictment was only hours away. "You cannot do this to me!" Marcus shrieked, kicking his legs as the troopers forcefully dragged him toward the ballroom doors. I am Marcus Caldwell. I own this city. Nia, tell them to stop. His screams faded into pathetic, breathless sobs as the heavy oak doors swung open. The press corps rushed forward, their camera flashes illuminating his weeping, terrified face as the police shoved him out into the lobby. I watched him disappear, feeling nothing but a profound, cleansing emptiness. Near the VIP tables, Chloe Caldwell aggressively smoothed the front of her torn designer gown. She did not shed a single tear for the husband who had just tried to strangle her. She did not look toward the doors where Marcus was being hauled away to a federal holding cell. Instead, she reached into her crystal clutch and pulled out her smartphone. She dialed a number with rapid, furious precision. She held the phone to her ear, her eyes cold and calculating as she surveyed the wreckage of the Caldwell family. "Wake up, David!" Chloe snapped into the receiver, her voice loud enough for the lingering journalists to hear. "I do not care what time it is. I need you to draft the divorce papers immediately. I want full custody, I want absolute immunity, and I want every single asset frozen before the Fed sees the accounts. Get it done right now." Chloe snapped her phone shut, slipping it back into her crystal clutch with the clinical efficiency of an assassin sheathing a blade. She did not cast a single backward glance at the broken figures of her parents-in-law. She simply adjusted the strap of her gown, lifted her chin, and marched toward the side exit, leaving the Caldwell name entirely in her wake. Her departure broke the spell that had held the rest of the ballroom hostage. It was as if a silent collective alarm had sounded, signaling the toxic hazard of standing too close to ground zero. The exodus began. Senator Hayes, a man who had practically lived at the Caldwell estate during campaign season, deliberately turned his back and walked briskly in the opposite direction. The regional bank directors, the very men Richard had golfed with just yesterday, gathered their coats and moved toward the exit without uttering a single syllable of condolence. Women who had kissed Vivian's cheeks and praised her charity work now averted their eyes, whispering behind manicured hands, their faces contorted in expressions of naked, undisguised contempt. They parted like the Red Sea, forming a wide, barren circle of absolute isolation around Richard and Vivian. Richard stood frozen in the center of that devastating void. He reached out a trembling hand toward a passing investor, a man he had mentored for a decade. The investor did not even break his stride, swerving sharply to avoid physical contact. The sheer, overwhelming totality of their social and financial death was finally complete. They were no longer Atlanta royalty, they were untouchables. Vivian remained crumpled on the floor, her fake tears drying into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock as she watched her entire social universe systematically abandon her. I stood on the edge of the dais, watching the empire burn down to its foundations. Every slight, every dismissal, every stolen opportunity, and every cruel remark had led to this exact flawless execution. I had not just defeated them, I had completely dismantled the very architecture of their reality. I stepped off the platform and walked slowly toward them, the click of my heels cutting through the frantic murmurs of the departing crowd. Richard flinched as I approached, his arrogant posture replaced by the cowering stance of a beaten animal. "I told you earlier that you had 48 hours to vacate my property," I said, my voice cutting through the remaining noise in the room, sharp and unforgiving. "But considering Chloe has just accelerated the timeline and federal agents will likely be freezing every personal account you have left by sunrise, I am amending that offer." Richard's breath hitched. Vivian let out a pathetic whimpering gasp. "You have 24 hours, I stated, my eyes locking onto Richard's terrified face. "Be out of my house by midnight tomorrow. If there is a single piece of your furniture left inside when the clock strikes 12, I will have it dragged to the curb and set on fire." I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left for them to say, and nothing left for me to hear. I turned my back on the ruins of the Caldwell family. I walked down the center aisle of the Grand St. Regis ballroom. The remaining guests, the titans of industry and the political elite, immediately stepped aside. They parted from me not out of courtesy, but out of absolute terrified respect. I reached the grand entrance. I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air of the city that now belonged to me. The doors swung shut behind me, with a heavy, definitive thud, locking the Caldwells inside a tomb constructed entirely of their own rotting lies. The heavy echo of those oak doors shutting seems to reverberate, shifting rapidly from the harsh, unforgiving acoustics of the St. Regis ballroom into a soft, melodic hum. The chaotic flashes of press cameras and the terrified shouts of the Atlanta elite blur, dissolving seamlessly into the warm, golden glow of a quiet morning. The camera pulls back in a long, incredibly smooth dolly shot. The polished marble floors of the hotel transition into rich, dark mahogany hardwood. The frame widens steadily, pulling backward to reveal the expansive, sunlit living room of my penthouse suite. The space is a sanctuary of quiet, unassailable power. Floor-to-ceiling windows frame the sprawling city skyline, bathing the room in natural light. Every wall, every carefully positioned pedestal showcases museum-quality artwork created exclusively by brilliant Black artists. They are powerful, vibrant pieces of modern sculpture and striking portraiture that pulse with the exact kind of life and fierce resilience my former family always tried to extinguish. I am seated comfortably in a plush velvet armchair, the morning light catching the gold rim of the delicate porcelain teacup I hold in my hand. I take a slow, deliberate sip. The tea is perfectly steeped. The silence in my home is not the paralyzed, terrified quiet of a ruined dynasty. It is the absolute, tranquil silence of total victory. 6 months have passed since that night. The justice system, usually so painfully slow, moved with ruthless, terrifying efficiency when fueled by ironclad financial records and a highly motivated governor. Marcus is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and aggravated assault. His golden boy charm, once his greatest currency in the world, means absolutely nothing inside a 6x9 concrete cell. He has traded custom-tailored tuxedos for a standard-issue jumpsuit. Chloe Ever, the apex survivalist, filed her divorce papers the very morning after the gala. She demanded full immunity and whatever liquid assets were left. The courts granted her the divorce, but the federal asset forfeiture swept the board entirely clean. She walked away with absolutely nothing but the torn couture gown on her back and a permanently destroyed reputation. The woman who once looked down on the entire city is now forced to live in her sister's cramped, windowless basement. As for Richard and Vivian, they received no mercy. I accelerated the foreclosure on the West Paces Ferry estate exactly as promised. The county sheriff escorted them off the property in broad daylight, and the local media broadcasted every humiliating second. Stripped of their wealth, their company, and their stolen prestige, they were forced to rent a cramped, dilapidated apartment in a neighborhood Richard used to refuse to even drive through. Their former high society friends deleted their numbers overnight. The elite country clubs revoked their lifetime memberships with immediate effect. When Vivian walks down the street, the women she used to play tennis with actively cross to the other side to avoid acknowledging her existence. They are completely invisible now, ghosts haunting the very city they once believed they ruled. I set my teacup down on the polished glass table, the delicate clink breaking the quiet. People often say that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase as a weapon to demand loyalty from the very people they actively abuse. But blood means absolutely nothing if the people sharing it only exist to drain you dry. True family is not a biological obligation. It is an active, conscious choice. Family is the circle of people you choose, the people who respect your mind, protect your peace, and celebrate your power. I look out over the city stretching for miles below my window, a sprawling kingdom I conquered not by inheriting a crown, but by forging my own sword. I smile, a gentle, deeply genuine expression that finally reaches my eyes. I never belonged in their world, because I was born to own it. The screen slowly fades to black.